Hello, it's Dr. Dena Churchill, Innovator of Women's Health and Wellness, here with you today to discuss mandatory vaccines. Mandatory. Let's look at that word, mandatory. I mean, anything with the word man in it is going to signify linear thought. Right, ladies? Just kind of kidding. But, really that's a science statement more than a sex statement, because men have smaller corpus callosums, thinner corpus callosums, which is the material that connects both hemispheres in your brain. So they're more task oriented. They'll see how A affects B. But women are more global in their thinking. So they have a larger corpus callosum and they'll think how A affects B, C, D, and E. So they're more global, or what we call quantum in their thinking. So I don't think you'd see mandated vaccines. I don't think you'd see woman-dated vaccines, because women tend to think in, like I said, a more global or quantum way. So it's the women who I appeal to in this message today, because women are the ones that are birthing and growing our next generation. Women make 75% of women make the healthcare decisions for their family, not only for themselves, but for their kids and for their families, for their husbands, for their parents, for their husbands' parents. So it's women that I'd like to address today in this video, because with women, the power and our perspective, I think, is really what's going to shift this paradigm. We're tapped into the forces of creation and the forces to change the current paradigm. So, mandated vaccines. How do they sell mandated vaccines? Well, they're selling them to us with fear and using our ignorance. So, what do I want to say about that first? Well, let's look at the Disney. So first it was at Disney, the mandated vaccines, where there's 26 cases in Disney. So now there's a state of an emergency. Then they played the same trick in Washington a few months ago. 36 cases of vaccines, of measles. Now we need to do mandatory vaccines. And just recently they've done this same sort of media scare tactic in New York City, where apparently, again, it's hard to trust the media and what's true and what's not. But I see Corey is there. So thank you, Corey, for your mentorship. But the vaccine, it's hard to know kind of what's real and what's not real. But 200 cases in New York City. So the mayor says, okay, mandatory MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella. And if you don't vaccinate, then we're going to give you a $1,000 fine. So if you don't vaccinate and they can't get your money that way, then they're going to charge you $1,000 for not vaccinating. But it's a scare tactic, because states of emergency, true states of emergency, are not 26 cases or 32 or 200. I've made up these numbers because they keep changing in the media. But it's not measles that are a state of emergency, right? Our opiate crisis is a state of emergency. The state of emergency is our ignorance towards what's happening. A state of emergency is that we have so many of our kids on psychiatric drugs. 26 cases of measles is not a state of emergency. Why are they telling us those things? Money. It's money. And I'll explain to you a little bit more about that paradigm as we go through. But states of emergency, it's truly a scare tactic. The measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine wasn't introduced until 1971. So as a baby, I didn't have measles, mumps. I didn't have that vaccine. In fact, I had mumps. So this is the old treatment for mumps, okay? My mom, because her glands were swollen, took a scarf, kind of like this, put up underneath our chin and tied up our jaw, where we had swollen glands. I mean, that was the old treatment of mumps. I had chicken pox. We had a big chicken pox party. So these diseases don't kill us. Why is it a state of emergency? In fact, the research shows that these diseases actually help strengthen our immune system. And we'll see things like chickenpox, for example, protects against the other varicella viruses. So if you had chickenpox as a kid, you're less likely to have shingles and the people around you. So I had chickenpox. My kids had chickenpox. So my parents got a booster when my kids had chickenpox. So the parents are protected, getting their little natural booster, and also the grandparents. So what we see now is we're taking away that opportunity for chickenpox, is that we have more shingles cases, and we're seeing it in younger and younger people. So the vaccine, the natural childhood illnesses actually have a protective effect. Now, let's look at the flip side of that. There's nothing in a vaccine. So my point is that measles, mumps, and rubella won't kill you, although death is listed as a side effect in the product insert of many of the vaccines. So let's pretend this is a needle. This is a vaccine with measles, mumps, and rubella. What else do they put in that? Well, heavy metals. Okay, and then they have, so, you know, mercury and aluminum, things like that. Then they have something called glyphosate, which is a water-soluble poison. It was actually patented, Corey told me this, as a natural antibiotic. So it's also what they spray Roundup, you know, on our genetically modified foods, which is another source of toxins that I won't get into today. But they have glyphosate in there. And then this little screw, I say screw because it really screws up your DNA, okay, are retroviruses. So what's a retrovirus? This is a virus that comes from animals because they have to grow these vaccines on animal tissue. So monkey and mouse tissue in particular is what Dr. Judy Merkowitz has studied, and she was a researcher with the CDC, Center of Disease Control and Prevention. And she said there's millions of HIV and chronic fatigue cases that actually come from these retroviruses that you'll not only see now, but you'll see in our population for years to come. So there's nothing in a vaccine that supports your immune system, right? There's nothing in a vaccine that supports your immune system. And that's a hard concept to swallow when we've been told this is our health care. So what happens? Okay, they inject this into our system with all these adjuvants attached. They have to attach these things to the vaccine because they want to irritate our nervous system. They want to irritate the immune system. So when they irritate the immune system, it increases inflammation. It increases our white blood cells. So we know chronic inflammation, right, causes disease. So what does chronic inflammation cause in kids? Can anyone tell me? Give me one disease that, you know, a vaccine will, how it will show up in a kid. Inflammation. Okay, inflammation in your lungs is going to be asthma. Inflammation in your skin is going to be eczema. Inflammation in your nose and sinus and tonsils is going to be allergies or tonsil problems. Inflammation in your brain is going to be autism. Autism also has some other, you know, heavy metals and things involved, but let's just say epilepsy or brain problems or learning disabilities. Inflammation in your gut is going to be leaky gut. All these problems right now with allergies and gut issues are because the tight junctions are being broken down by this glyphosate in our environment, spraying on the genetically modified foods and put in our vaccines. So it could be food allergies. So this is inflammation. So they give us this shot with all these things attached, poof, into our body. Our body creates what we call a T2 response, immune response. So if you get it naturally, boom, you get a response, it goes away, you have lifelong immunity. With this, it creates a temporary inflammation. Once the inflammation starts to wear off, then you need your booster. So just as your allergies are improving and your asthma is improving, you go and have a booster because they're going to create more chronic inflammation. So you can see a problem, right? I mean, inflammation is just one of them, but the scary one is this screw here that screws up your DNA, and that's something called retroviruses. If you need any resources to the information I'm presenting, please connect with me, and I'll put some in here at the end, but connect or ask questions. I see Corey's putting some YouTube links there underneath, so thank you, Corey, for that. If you have anything to add, if you have a question, think I'm missing something, please put it in here. If you have any research you want to include, again, we're working as a team. I love this. So right now, I'm going to put the picture of a vaccine. Corey, if you have access to that, you could put it up too for me, but it's a vaccine schedule. So the MMR vaccine wasn't introduced until 1971. So like I said, all of us that lived before 1971 have less allergies. We have less disease. In fact, the kids born today are the only generation ever that are sicker than their parents. So if these massive amounts of vaccines were working, our kids would be sicker, would be healthier, not sicker. I mean, right now, kids require 68 vaccines by the time they're 16 years old. It's crazy. And the kicker, is that there's no safety studies. No one has researched what this cumulative effect of all this stuff stuck to a vaccine 68 different times by the time you're 16 does to your system. How do I know there's no safety studies? Because I asked. When I was considering vaccinating my kids, I asked my doctor. And that's what any responsible parent should do. Ask for safety studies. I mean, if you are buying a car, you'll check on Consumer Reports or something. I don't know. If you're buying a blender, you'll check to see which is the red. So research, know what's being pumped into your little babies. Because what I found out is that there's no research studies. It's so scary. There's no controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled safety studies. What does that mean? So the gold standard when you're researching something means that you have a group that's tested and a group that's not. So the not group is called the placebo group. When you're double blind, it means the researcher doesn't know which is which. There's none of those gold standard studies with any of the vaccines. Now, I asked questions. I sent letters to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. I also approached our provincial health minister and our federal health minister looking for safety studies for vaccines. They don't exist. So now they're mandating something in the United States, in these different states, that have no safety studies. And there's more to the story. So the CDC, Center of Disease Control and Prevention, that recommends safety regulations, also are buying vaccines. There's more than 50 patents owned by people in the CDC, Center of Disease Control and Prevention, and they're a vaccine company. They purchased $4.6 billion worth of vaccines. So naturally, they're going to push them because they have $4.6 billion sitting on their shelf that they need to unload. So here's the paradigm. The CDC, people who own the vaccines, are making the rules and making it mandatory for everyone underneath in that whole medical paradigm. So your physician, so this is the other thing I hear. Why doesn't my doctor tell me the dangers of vaccines? Because your doctor will lose their license if they encourage you not to vaccinate. I know, because I lost mine. My chiropractic license was suspended for views that I had on my own personal page. It wasn't even something I was recommending to patients. These were my own personal views. So finally, I just, exhausted my resources and my heart and surrendered my license because I couldn't afford to dance with Big Pharma. But know that your doctor, there was another pediatrician that lived on Oxford Street that also had his license taken away because he was trying to split up the vaccines to make it less dangerous for the kids. So your doctor's not going to be able to tell you not to vaccinate. They're not going to be able to give you the pros and cons because they're not allowed. So the onus is on you as the parent, just like if you were buying a car or you were investigating, which blender to buy. You have to look and research these vaccines for yourself. And if you need information, come to me. I'm collecting resources. I love to share that information. So, and now that I don't have a license, I can share it openly. The other problem is 1986, there was a law passed by President Reagan that absolved vaccination companies of any liability. So if your child is brain damaged, if your child has injury, disease from a vaccine, you can't sue the vaccine company. They have what they called a blanket liability that Robert Kennedy, famous lawyer, Kennedy family, Robert Kennedy Jr. says it's not found anywhere else in business, this blanket liability. How can the people who are giving our vaccines and responsible for the health care of our environment and our population be absolved of any accountability regarding the products that they're selling? It's wild. So this is what sets this standard. This is what they're playing on, is your ignorance about this to make vaccines mandatory. Now, why am I talking about it now? Because I'm Canadian here in Nova Scotia, Canada, is because what happens in the States will eventually come to Canada. We've seen the trick, like I said, in Disney in California, in Washington, New York City. It's starting, and they're playing the same game. They're using scare tactics. State of emergency, state of emergency. Measles are not a friggin' state of emergency. Yes, any questions? Corey, thanks for posting all those links. Thanks, Tanya, Bobby, Tricia, Robert, for joining. Hang in there. And I'm just going to talk about a few other things. So there's nothing in a vaccine. Let me summarize that stimulates the immune system. In fact, all these things are added to aggravate your immune system, to cause an inflammatory reaction called a T2 reaction, and that stays with you. When the inflammation starts to decrease, boom, you're due for a booster. The unvaccinated people pose no risk. This is another myth, right? That if you're not vaccinated, you're going to somehow cause risk to the population. Think about that. If you believe in vaccines and believe that they work, then if you're vaccinated, you have nothing to worry about. In fact, some of the vaccines that they inject actually have viral shedding if it's a live attenuated virus. So if you are vaccinated, you can actually shed the virus onto somebody who's not vaccinated. So really, it's the unvaccinated that should be more concerned. But Harvard study, again, I have that if you'd like it, shows that there's zero risk to the population from an unvaccinated person. So we talked about that. And it also shows, there's a homeschool study that shows that the unvaccinated kids are actually healthier for those reasons that I said. You're not creating the inflammation, so you don't have the allergies, asthma, autism, what were some of the other things I said? Eczema, epilepsy, food sensitivities, learning disabilities. You don't see that in homeschooled kids or in the Amish society who didn't vaccinate. There were no incidents of autism in Amish societies that had no incidents of vaccination. So these are correlations, I know, because there hasn't been a real study to look at that. But that's really where it needs to be right now. What other points did I want to make? No double-blind placebo safety studies. So there's no safety studies, no gold standard safety studies. They've tested vaccines, but against each other. They've tested mumps against measles, for example, but not against a control group. Conflict of interest, we talked about that because the CDC purchases vaccines. So the people that are purchasing and benefiting from vaccines are also the people that are recommending it. Again, conflict of interest doesn't really seem sane and legal, but know that. The myth that vaccines eradicated disease. This is one I hear all the time. But what about polio and the iron lung? And okay, go back to the history books. If you're reading something on the internet, the CDC is going to have a vested interest. So things that they put in there, or let's say Snopes, which is a husband and wife team on the Monsanto payroll. So they have a vested interest in telling you lies because they're wanting to sell the product. They will say, oh, yep, vaccines are safe, no problems there. And they eradicated disease. But again, if you want some other perspective, some historical non-biased perspective, email me and I'll send you the links to those studies. But our diseases were on a natural decline before, in the 1900s, before vaccines were introduced. So they were naturally burning themselves out of the population, right, with sanitation and better foods and water, cleaner water. And the vaccine companies just took credit for it. In fact, after the polio vaccine, there was a spike in polio. So if you're looking at correlation, it looked like the polio vaccine caused more cases of polio. And even with the polio, I mean, that was introduced around the same time that DDT was introduced. That was causing a lot of neurological symptoms. So there's some conversation and argument around whether all these iron lung cases were actually from a polio virus that was contracted naturally. So again, vaccines didn't cure disease, didn't eradicate disease. Vaccines are causing more problems in our health. And we can see that because the countries now that have the highest vaccine rates have the highest infant mortality rates. So again, step back from what you've been told because it's a lie and look at it from a logical perspective and do your own research. What else do I want to say? Well, it's mandated in the US, it'll eventually come to Canada. So that's why I'm talking to you about it now. I want you to be informed. I want you to do your research now. So if it comes to be media, let's say the media, CBC, I love CBC, let's say they suddenly say, oh, state of emergency in Toronto, we have 26 cases of measles, you will know the difference. You will know it's not a state of emergency, and you will know the motivation behind why they're doing it, right? CBC. The media, let's talk about that for a moment, because if you Google my name, Dr. Dena Churchill and vaccines, you will see a whole slew of different stories about how my license has been suspended and I'm incapable of practicing and my judgment has been interfered with. And so the CDC, what I've seen is they won't publish a story that hasn't been approved by Snopes S-N-O-P-E-S, Snopes, husband and wife team on the Monsanto payroll. So here's our Canadian Broadcasting Company supplying news and media nationally, but they will not comment on a story that's not approved by Snopes. But still, they will drag me through the coals for giving you the truth, and my license will be suspended because I'm telling you the truth. Don't trust the media. So when you see next time, measles, state of emergency, you'll know it's a joke. It's a money-making tool. It's a money-making tactic that the vaccine companies are using. Now, let's talk about the flu vaccine for a moment. Any questions? I'm almost finished. So the flu vaccine, this is the one. Okay, so Robert Kennedy Jr., he's a lawyer, an environmental lawyer that was researching mercury. And a friend of his came to him and said, can you look at the, amount of mercury in a vaccine? And he did some research, and so basically once he's seen what mercury was in a vaccine, he took it on as part of his career path, I guess, seeing how much mercury and heavy metals were in these vaccines. So in a flu shot, there is 250 times more mercury than what the environment allows. 250 more times. So if you drop a flu shot on the floor in your doctor's office, you have to call the biochemical hazmat team to come clean it up because it's 250 times more mercury than what the environment allows, right? 250 more times. This is what you're injecting into your babies and to your pregnant mothers. 250 times the mercury that the environment allows for. Flu shot. Another money-making scam, because now you just don't go to your doctor for the flu shot. You can go to your supermarket. Sobeys, you can get a flu shot. So flu shots are everywhere. And the resources. So if you need any resources, call me, text me, put questions. Looks like Corey's popping up there and putting lots of resources in, and I'll post some a little later. Any questions before we go? No? So I just want to say that really, be prepared for what's coming, because I know that this is going to filter into Canada. And I want you as mothers to be informed and to ask questions, because they will benefit monetarily on your ignorance. And it's not just for yourself. Because I used to think, my oldest son is 21 and he's never been vaccinated, and my 17-year-old's never been vaccinated. I used to think if I could provide that example, then that would be enough. But it's not. If we don't talk to other people about it, the government mandates, requires us, forces us to vaccinate when there's no safety studies. This is ludicrous. It's crazy. So educate yourself, please. Educate mothers. The greatest, the common factor in those who don't vaccinate, the most common factor, anyone know? I'm going to put that out there. Anyone know the most common factor amongst all the parents that don't vaccinate? The most common thing, internet access. So the more educated the parents are, the less they tend to vaccinate because they have more information. So information is powerful. It gives you knowledge. And with knowledge and your own mothering intuition, it's really the wisdom that's going to change this current paradigm. Really. It's the women. It's the power and our global perspective that will shift the current paradigm. So mothers, let's join forces together. Email me and I'll send you the information I have. I'll give you resources to other people. Cheryl Tenpenny is great. The Vaccine Network, Del Bigtree, Aaron at HealthNet News. There's so many people that are really helping educate our public. Mainstream media won't. They're paid, their salaries are paid, their donations heavily influence them into what they will say and what they will publish. So independent media is where you need to get the truth and the information that's going to help you and your family. So I appreciate you watching. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Corey, for all those links. Bobby, thank you. Tanya, Robert, and I invite you to reach for the stars, envision and achieve your personal best, and most of all, enjoy the journey. This is Dr. Dena Churchill signing out.